All right, so welcome to the Quadruple D, episode 64, part 2, where I look at the pathetic peripheral poop head of the week, and that is the pathetic, racist ass Strom Thurmond. That's right, I'm picking on a long dead racist peckerhead named Strom Thurmond. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was famous for being racist and really not much else. And I'm talking about him partly because he actually ties into Lindsey Graham's existence as a politician. So Strom Thurmond has a legacy that echoes through the ages, I guess you might say, a toxic legacy. And yeah, it's a. I've talked about Strom Thurmond before, but in that episode, I was sort of zeroing in on a specific scandal. This time, I'm just going to give a little bit more of a biography of this scoundrel. So, Strom Thurmond remained a powerful and deeply controversial figure in U.S. politics for decades, shaping South Carolina's political direction long after his early career. His influence even extended into later generations of politicians. For example, he campaigned on behalf of Lindsey Graham. Yes, that senator. The word senator itself is almost just like an insult at this point. Uh, you could just insult somebody by calling them a politician. You could say their job title, and it's sort of a stand in for whatever sort of filthy uh, language you would want to throw in there. But anyway, it really shows you that, political networks tied to segregationist power structures persisted well into the late 20th century. There's still that ripple effects that's being felt today with the obvious presence of these neo Confederates, these neo Nazi types. Those types who are out there, and there's a reason that they exist, and it's largely because of Strom Thurmond. People like that sort of giving these people a focus, like a sort of mouthpiece, a bullhorn. And before his long Senate career, Thurmond served as governor of South Carolina from 1947 to 1951. He first gained national prominence during the 1948 U.S. presidential election when he ran as the Dixiecrat candidate in open opposition to President Harry S. Truman's modest civil rights proposals. Thurmond carried four deep South states and won over a million votes, campaigning explicitly on maintaining racial segregation. The Dixiecrat movement itself emerged as a reactionary split from the Democratic Party, aiming to preserve Jim Crow laws and white political control in the South. So, in many ways, Strom Thurmond really sort of represented, he embodied the Dixiecrat movement, and he sort of represents, he encapsulates in human form the Southern strategy. And you can really see how state power has often historically been used to enforce racial hierarchy. Rather than just being neutral, electoral politics often functions to legitimize systems of domination, with candidates like Thurmond openly defending racial apartheid as states' rights. I'm sure you've heard that word over and over again. Well, it turns out usually the term states' rights is a way to defend rotten ideas, because when it comes down to it, when you see these Republicans, these conservatives or right wingers in action, they're just as soon going to abandon the whole states' rights argument when it is convenient. They'll be clamoring for the defense of states' rights in this certain policy proposal over here, but they'll reject it over there. It's not about logical consistency, it's about getting certain desired outcomes. And I'm sure you can easily think of some examples of that if you are at all immersed in politics and really paying attention to how these right wing brains function or don't function, depending on how you really want to look at it. But it's never about logical consistency. It's just about what is convenient as an argument in the heat of the moment. And Thurmond entered the U.S. Senate in 1954 and remained there for nearly half a century, one of the longest tenures in U.S. history. During the height of the civil rights movement, he became one of the most vocal defenders of segregation. In 1957, he carried out the longest single person filibuster in Senate history, speaking for 24 hours and 18 minutes to block the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And this act itself was relatively limited, mainly focused on protecting black voting rights, yet even these minimal reforms were fiercely resisted by some of these Southern politicians. Well, probably all of them at the time. I don't know. I don't know if there's an exception to that. I didn't really dig that deep into this, but it was definitely something that a lot of these Thurmond like people were really against. And fortunately, Senator Cory Booker broke Thurmond's record. And look, I gotta be honest with you, Cory Booker is not himself a perfect person or a perfect politician. I do have my critiques of him, and I think he should probably be primaried even. But, I'm gonna put that aside here and just say it's still good that someone broke Thurmond's rotten record. So yeah, good for Cory Booker. That's probably going to be one of the best things in his legacy. That's a bit of a milestone, and you kind of have to respect. I mean, as rotten as Strom Thurmond was, I mean, speaking for 24 hours, that's a tough thing to do. But I respect Cory Booker more, definitely for speaking for the right side of history on that specific issue. I believe it was actually a relatively good thing that he was speaking for, whereas Strom Thurmond was a scoundrel in what he was trying to defend, the viewpoint he was representing. Anyway, Thurmond also voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both of which aimed to dismantle legal segregation and voter suppression. These laws were responses to widespread violence and disenfranchisement imposed by state governments, including literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation campaigns. And what do you think is going to happen in the midterms? I think we will see some real attempts at all of those things, like maybe not literacy tests exactly, but the campaign for needing people to get IDs is sort of like a poll tax, unless it's paid for by the government, which they actually don't seem like they want to do. They don't want to make the IDs free because it's actually an attempt to suppress voter turnout. They know that some people struggle to afford even simple things like, I don't know, $20 or whatever it would be for a state ID. Maybe it would just be like $10. Oh yeah, that's right. That's I shouldn't say state ID because actually, from what I understand, like the voter suppression law that they're trying to get, or the bill that they're trying to pass into law, it does not even accept state IDs. I think it requires, like a birth certificate or a passport, that sort of crap, because the object, again, it's not to have increased security, it's to exclude certain people from voting, people who don't have the money to buy IDs and things like that. And these agonizingly stupid right wingers out there, they'll be like, well, I can afford it, therefore everybody can afford it. They'll be like that. They'll make that kind of stupid argument. But of course, it's not the real world. There are people out there who struggle to afford all kinds of things. Even you know you could be down to your last dollar. Do you think you can spend uh, a bunch of money on just all these different things? And think of it this way, I mean, $5 here, $10 there, $20 there. All of that adds up, even those small little costs that people have out of every paycheck or whatever, they all add up. It seems small if you look at the expenses individually a lot of the time, but if you add it all together, it can wipe a person out pretty easily. That's why we have so many people who live from paycheck to paycheck. And what do you know? These elitist Republicans want to exclude poor people from voting, and especially if you're a non-white person, but of course some white people would also be caught up in this problem as well. And they also want to have access to look at the voters themselves and look at their voting records, and if they voted for Democrats, do you think that Trump would not try to purge them from having the vote? What, are you kidding me? This is the same guy who tried to overturn the 2020 election illegally, and I could get into how Merrick Garland totally messed that up. He dropped the ball. Now I know some defenders of Merrick Garland and all of that, all of those people back then. They would say, well, it takes time to get these things passed, but the point is they didn't have as much time. They should have worked overtime to fast track these efforts at holding Trump accountable for trying to overturn the 2020 election and all of that. It should be viewed as a form of massive fraud against the American public, because obviously it was all an attempt to get rid of the results of the 2020 election, and it was all because Trump lost. That's the only thing. That's the only reason he considers it an illegitimate outcome, because he wasn't the one who won. So, if you know, and keep in mind, it's not just about that either. Even in the elections where Trump won, like 2016, Trump still claimed that there was widespread fraud even back then. So it's a game that he plays to put it into people's minds that the elections are fraudulent, even if he wins, because he does not want elections, and these Republicans do not want democracy. And, I remember this quote from Cleta Mitchell. She was, or she is still, some right wing person, and she was complaining to some group about how college voters, they can just roll out of bed and easily get to the voting location and then go back into bed, like that was an actual problem. This Cleta Mitchell creature. And I can't even imagine being in that mindset where you'd be able to speak about that like it was a problem in a public place. Like, these weren't even just thoughts that she kept in her head. She was somehow prepared to actually share that idea with another group of people, and apparently that was something that everyone there agreed is a problem. The idea that how dare these young college age voters be able to easily roll out of bed, go cast their vote, and then go home and go back to bed. Well, that's not a problem. That's a good thing, but not for these Republicans. They want to suppress the votes, and in so many ways, they've told us that already. Anyway, I got a little bit sidetracked here talking about voting in general. So back to Strom Thurmond. Thurmond justified his opposition to, having all these people being able to vote by invoking states' rights again. And that's a phrase frequently used to defend local control over systems of racial exclusion, and in some cases, other forms of exclusion as well. Like, they talk about, the right to criminalize women who have had abortions, or crack down on gay rights, or people who want to smoke pot. You know, they use the states' rights arguments for a lot of that kind of stuff. So basically, States have a right to crack down on people's freedoms, but not much else, you know? And I suppose that the racial exclusion one is, having its roots in the segregation and the racism stuff, but so is like the drug war too, if you look into it. And so is a lot of other stuff. Like when it comes to even the abortion issue, it's uh it's something that most likely ties into their ideology about white supremacy and eugenics. Like they don't want to see white people being aborted because they view white people as supreme over the other groups. But when it comes down to it, like if you really think about it, there are, right wingers who are perfectly fine with actual genocides and stuff like that. When it comes to foreign people or brown people, if you will, overseas, when it comes to like invading other countries and bombing them, destroying their infrastructure, uh, you know, mass imprisonment like what happened in Iraq. They're often perfectly fine with that. They're fine with alligator Alcatraz, as it was called, or alligator Auschwitz, where they celebrated the mere idea that immigrants might end up being chomped to death by crocodiles or alligator, not crocodiles, but alligators, I guess. And that's something that they celebrate because at the heart of it, these people are sadistic and they are racist. They like the idea of immigrants suffering and all that kind of stuff. Well, that doesn't sound like people who are all that pro-life. And in fact, Trump has launched a bunch of different wars, of course, and he's called immigrants all these like violent. He's called them all just like violent criminals and said that they eat cats and dogs and stuff like that. Just a bunch of racist tropes all the time. So we can really easily detect what their motivations are. And historically, states' rights arguments often have masked the preservation of unequal power structures in general. And there's a broader issue here because decentralization alone does not guarantee freedom if local authorities maintain these coercive hierarchies. And in Thurmond's case, state sovereignty was used to resist federal intervention that sought to reduce oppression, even if imperfectly. So that's another lesson here. I mean, it's a little bit tough for some people to process this idea because it really isn't a perfect idea. But generally speaking, it doesn't matter so much whether it's the state or the federal government. What matters is whether or not the thing we're talking about would reduce oppression or increase oppression. That's really at the core of the issue, not whether it's the state having the policy or the federal government. Does it actually help people or does it harm them? So back to Thurmond, he was originally a Democrat, but Thurmond switched to the Republican Party in 1964, aligning himself with Barry Goldwater, the Republican presidential nominee who also opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this shift was part of a larger political realignment in which many white Southern politicians moved to the Republican Party as the Democrats began to support civil rights reform. So you might have heard that as the Southern strategy. So in many ways, Strom Thurmond sort of embodied that. Thurmond's switch made him the first Republican senator from South Carolina since Reconstruction, signaling a long term transformation in Southern political identity. Although Thurmond later claimed to have moderated his views in the 1970s, he never fully repudiated his earlier support for segregation, and he continued to defend it as a product of its time rather than acknowledging the systemic violence and exclusion that it upheld. And it is also a documented historical fact that Thurmond fathered a child with a black domestic worker when he was younger. And it's a reality that further shows the contradictions and power imbalances embedded in the social order that he so often defended. So keep in mind, like a lot of these people defend things like segregation or, you know, limiting the number of immigrants or minorities. But when it comes down to it, some of these people, these racists, they will nevertheless, attack these minorities sexually. And that's I had to use a creative bit of language there because there's an R word that YouTube does not like. But anyway, that's frequently what happens, and of course, it's not just sexual violence exactly. You can still have racists who do marry somebody who is non-white, and I know that sounds strange, like well that means they're not racist, right? Well, not necessarily. If you're just an immigrant basher, if you support a lot of these talking points against minority groups, like there's still going to be an element of racism in your ideology, even if you don't perfectly embody racism. And of course, we've seen things like Kanye West, or Ye as he likes to be called now, actually going well out of his way to praise Adolf Hitler and stuff like that. And we've seen, boy, I can't remember his name, but there was some politician who was running. I think he was lieutenant governor in some state. Maybe he still is, but he was outed as a black Nazi as well. And then, of course, Nick Fuentes. I'm not sure exactly of what his racial background is, but just listen to his last name. It's Fuentes, so he is considered Hispanic, and so it's a little bit ironic that he is so fascistic because a lot of these fascists out there would not be too keen on, having Hispanics in this country. So it's a little bit ironic and dark and strange. But, the point is that you can still be racist and fascist adjacent without even knowing it. Like if you're if you're one of those people who doesn't like the fact that Bad Bunny was singing in Spanish at the Super Bowl, like that was a super scandal. You're at least a little bit fascist adjacent. I know that might sound like a woke thing to say or whatever, but it's true. Like if you think the mere existence of people who speak Spanish is a serious problem, if you think that you have to press one on the phone in order to, have English, on your phone call, if you think that's like sort of like the end of the world or something just because you're mildly inconvenienced, well, you're at least a little bit fascist adjacent because you're saying that the state needs to exclude people who are non-English speakers. And of course, the actual solution, the humane solution to people speaking different languages that make you uncomfortable or whatever, the real solution to that is humane is to have bilingual education and to actually just get to know some of these people who are different from you. And of course, you might have some bad experiences with people outside of your group, whatever your group is, but that's going to be true no matter what. There are good people everywhere, bad people everywhere. Of course, most people are somewhere in between. We can be good or bad at various times. Especially when you're talking about young people versus old people. Some people start off worse when they're younger and get better as they age. Some people are actually better when they're younger and get worse as they age. So, you can find bad experiences with different groups of people everywhere you look. So, you got to put those fears aside and stop thinking of, everybody as just a group. You got to try to sometimes take people a little bit individually, you know? And I've also made it clear that even racists can sometimes change. So I'm not saying that if you are fascist adjacent or whatever, that you're that your views cannot be changed. Sometimes that does happen. People can evolve, they can learn from their mistakes, they can actually become a force for good in the world and all that sort of stuff. So it's not like a monolithic sort of thing that I'm talking about when I criticize racism or racists. I know that sometimes people can evolve. But anyway, Thurmond remained in the Senate until 2003, serving alongside only a handful of Democratic colleagues from South Carolina during that period, including Fritz Hollings. And his extraordinary long career adequately demonstrates how entrenched political systems can sustain figures tied to oppressive policies even as public norms shift. And unfortunately, of course, some of those norms haven't perfectly shifted in a more progressive direction as we've seen in the last decade or so. Well, I would say back in the back after the September 11th attacks, pretty soon after that happened, we saw some pretty dark developments happen in the United States culturally. So that was a bit of a culprit here in the resurgence of racism and whatnot. But it's also been true that there's always been a little bit of racism in our society. So even as norms shift, there's always going to be an element of society that's not perfectly shifted in the better direction. So, when viewed critically, Thurman's legacy is not just about one individual, but about how institutions can preserve inequality over generations. And his career, it shows how both major parties at different times enabled segregationist policies and reinforce the radical anarchic critique that hierarchical political systems tend to reproduce domination rather than eliminate it. And unfortunately, that's something we're still seeing today. And that's about all I have to say about Strom Thurmond for now. I probably will end up talking about him in a future episode way down the line, but I'm kind of tired of talking about him for the moment. So all right, I've got a part 3 episode that I'm probably going to record tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. And I'll be talking about you know basically a surprise type of topic. So again, be on the lookout for that. Feel free to subscribe and hit the like button, share the episode, comment on it, whatever you want to do. It's good for the algorithm if you do that kind of stuff. Anyway, I've said about enough. Have a good day.